Today, we will share and discuss the finding from a research paper that aims to understand the role of access to content for the uptake of broadband. And we are particularly interested in the role of services trade for providing access to content. Anakai Xu will present the paper. She is a research economist at the World Trade Organization, where she coordinates and contributes to the flagship World Trade Report. Her research focuses on trade aspects of the digital economy and sustainable development. Following the presentation, we have two discussants. Joël Carriol is a research officer at the Foundation for Studies and Research on International Development, popularly known as FERDI, and he's also an associate researcher at the Surrey University at Clermont-Auvergne. His current research focuses on the digitalization process and its impact on economic development. And he looks at this both from macro and micro perspective. His work popped up all the time when we searched the literature on broadband adoption in Africa. So we are very happy that you could join us today. The second discussant is Julia Lasonova from the International Telecommunication Union, where she has worked for 15 years. In her role as senior analyst, policy and regulation, she leads ITU's research and analysis on collaborative regulation for digital transformation and oversees policy and regulatory metrics, including the ICT regulatory tracker, and also the G5 benchmark and the Unified Benchmark Framework. We have used these tools extensively in the paper we present today, and we look very much forward to your comment. A couple of housekeeping issues. So the audience is encouraged to post questions in the chat throughout the presentations, and we will address them in the Q&A session. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the CEP YouTube channel. Thank you and welcome again. And Anakai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hildegard. Let me start with my sharing my screen. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure for me to present our joint paper with Hildegard on what's behind digital transformation in Africa. Before my presentation, the usual disclaimer applies. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not represent that of WTO members. The outline of my presentation is the following. I will start with background and motivation, and then we'll go through the research question, the literature, and present some of the stylized facts based on the data we have gathered. It will be followed by some preliminary results and concluding remarks. The starting point of our research is the fact that the African Union has envisaged an ambitious secured single African digital market by 2023, and the digital protocol of the AfCFTA supports this vision. So we wanted to know how the vision of creating a single market within the African region, particularly for services, would affect digital connectivity in the region. And we also note that there's still significant digital gap within the African continent, particularly when it comes to fixed broadband connections. So our research key question is on what determines the connectivity within Africa. And by that, we both look at the supply side and demand side. On supply side, we know that infrastructure and connectivity are key, which is determined by the market size, particularly in the telecommunications market. Scale economies is quite significant. But on demand side, we believe that content and regulations are quite important in generating the use of the internet. And interestingly, as we will present a bit later, there is a usage gap within Africa in the sense that the connectivity do not always align with use of the internet infrastructure. So we also try to explore the usage gap in Africa and try to disentangle some of the factors behind this usage gap. So our hypothesis is that digital content could stimulate demand for connectivity, and digital services trade could also contribute to this content. On the other hand, the connectivity would contribute to digital services trade as well. So there's a bit of two-way interactions and openness to trade investment through regulations and through competition, in particular in telecommunications sector, could stimulate the demand of connectivity. In terms of the literature, there are quite some studies looking at digital connectivity and different economic outcomes, including economic development, employment, gender equality, and the others, including Joel's paper as well. But there's a bit of limited literature on what determines the digital connectivity itself. There's a few papers from the past decade looking at how competition regulations, political stability, and other factors, and other supply side factors in particular, that have helped or deterred the digital connectivity and infrastructure development in Africa. So the data that we use in this analysis comes from several sources. On the regulations and infrastructure side, most of the data comes from International Telecommunications Union. We're really grateful for the comprehensive data provided by ITU. We have used some analysis looking at internet speed, and that data comes from Ookla, a private data company. In terms of digital services trade, we use data ITPDE database that captures trade, including domestic trade in several sectors. And alternatively, we used BATIS data, which is co-developed by the WTO and OECD, that have a more comprehensive country coverage for trading services. And additionally, we use the CEPI's gravity data in our analysis. So the first stylized facts I want to present is the following. That there is indeed a gap between the digital connectivity access or infrastructure coverage versus the uptake of digital connectivity. And this figure shows on the left side other regions than Africa, and on the right side Africa. The red line is the 45-degree line. And if access and the use of digital connectivity are aligned, then the green line should, the fitted line of these dots should overlap with the red line. But clearly, particularly for Africa, these two lines do not overlap. And our regression analysis further shows that the line shifts downward for Africa by approximately 4 subscriptions per 100 inhabitants. And the slope is also a bit flat. This clearly shows that there is a usage gap, that even if sometimes the infrastructure is there, not everyone is using the internet infrastructure. So we set out to discover why there's the usage gap. The first reason came up clearly is the affordability issue. And this figure shows that it shows the percentage of monthly income per capita spent on digital connectivity. In terms of mobile connectivity, it costs about 6% of monthly gross national income in Africa versus 2% in other regions. And in terms of fixed broadband connectivity, in Africa, it would cost about 21% of an average person's monthly income versus 5% in other regions. So affordability is clearly one issue that deters the use of internet infrastructure. And this could also be more clearly shown in this robust regression analysis. It's a simple regression, but it represents the elasticity of a demand curve. So there are 2 findings from this simple regression. One is that there is a complementarity between fixed broadband use and mobile broadband use. As we can see that the price of fixed broadband is clearly negatively correlated with the use of fixed broadband, but the price of mobile broadband is also negatively linked with fixed broadband uptake, although to a lesser extent. The same can be said for mobile broadband usage. And the second thing we can notice is that is reflected in the coefficient for the Africa dummy. For the demand curve for Africa is basically lower than for other regions for fixed broadband connectivity, whereas the demand curve for Africa is higher for the mobile broadband connectivity. And the second reason that we believe contributes to the usage gap is the skills or education level. And we have done an analysis here looking at different indicators of skills or education levels. And two of those variables that stood out as being positively and significantly correlated with the fixed broadband uptake. One is the years of compulsory education, and the other is the average intermediary education, the share of population that's received average intermediate education. So this also clearly shows that levels of education and skills is positively correlated with the use of internet, particularly fixed broadband. And the third reason is indeed content. And here we think of digitally delivered services as a factor that generates content. And by digitally delivered services, we follow the definition that is common in the literature, which includes sectors such as telecommunications, intellectual property rights, recreation services, and a range of other sectors. And we can see that the share of digitally delivered services in total services trade is increasing for all regions, but Africa is lower in level compared with other regions. On average, the share of digitally delivered services account for 15 to 16% of the total services trade in Africa. Then another reason that we try to examine in our analysis is the regulations. And here we used ITU's regulatory tracker as an indicator of the quality of regulations. We can see that although Africa is generally lower in terms of their ITU tracker scores, they're more or less on par with the other regions. So with all the data sets at hand, we try to look at the determinants of the fixed broadband subscriptions. And in this table, we consider different factors one by one. First, we see, as expected, that the price of fixed broadband is negatively correlated with the uptake of broadband subscriptions, while income is positively correlated with the subscriptions. The regulations generally, as expected, is positively correlated with the uptake of broadband subscriptions. However, Africa, as indicated in the negative coefficient here, shows that the density Africa is lower than other regions. And as indicated in the interaction term between the ITU regulation tracker and Africa dummy, in the last column of this table, the marginal impact of regulation in Africa, if you consider this, the impact for all regions and impact of Africa, adding them together, the impact is almost negligible. So that's a quite interesting finding in our view, that it seems the regulations did not have too much impact on Africa's broadband subscription uptake. Then we ask the other question, since we're really looking at interactions between services, trade regulations, and connectivity. So we employed a structural gravity model, which is quite common in the literature, and look at what determines the trade of services, digitally delivered services in particular. And here we find that that for free trade agreement clearly has a positive impact on trading services, and goods trade as well. So the first two columns examines the impact of fixed broadband and mobile broadband separately, while the last column examines the fixed broadband and mobile broadband in one regression. We can see that when they're examined separately, fixed broadband has a larger impact on trade in digitally delivered services, whereas mobile broadband has a relatively smaller impact. And when they are put in one regression together, mobile broadband even have a lower correlation with digitally delivered services trade. This leads us to believe that fixed broadband seems to be a more important factor when it comes to the ability to participate in trade for countries. And the second set of regressions continue to use the structural gravity model, but more look at the impact of regulations. And we can see that in the first column, the impact of the ITU regulatory tracker is positively correlated with services trade, trading digitally delivered services in particular. Whereas in the second column, we look at the African region versus other regions separately. And we saw that African region has a negative marginal impact of the services of the ITU regulatory tracker. So this really is the most puzzling question we have found in our analysis so far. We thought of maybe this could be a data issue. So we looked at an alternative data set, the BATIS data set, which allow us to look at exporter side and importer side, the importer side separately. And we can also look at different sub-service sectors. And we can generally see that while the fixed broadband connectivity has a positive correlation with the services sectors that we have been examining, when it's interacted with the African dummy, the impact is either insignificant or negative. So this really led us to sort of question why the regulations have a negative correlation with the trading services when it comes to Africa. So we'll try to look at the time when the regulations were introduced. And we find that there might be a theory that regulations were introduced a bit earlier than other regions when it comes to the readiness of the market itself. This is a simple event analysis where we look at where is the Africa's digital connectivity when the fourth generation of regulations were introduced. For mobile, Africa had a 40% coverage when the fourth generation regulations were introduced, where other regions had a 60% coverage. And for fixed broadband, Africa's coverage was only at 1% when fourth generation regulations were introduced, where other regions has 22%. So we sort of hypothesized in the paper that there might be a bit of a premature introduction of regulations. The premature could refer to two factors. One is whether the infrastructure is there, ready for the regulations to be effective. And the second could be whether the governments would have the right capacity to implement these regulations. So, and I would look forward to more discussion in this respect. And in the last part of the paper, we try to look at demand and the supply factors all together in the simultaneous regressions. And we find, and in this table, the first two columns indicate the demand side factors with the broadband subscriptions as the sort of the dependent variable, whereas the second two columns look at the supply side. And we can see clearly that the prices are negatively correlated with the demand. The incomes are more or less positively correlated with the demand. What we're most interested in is how demand and supply are interacted with the services trade. And for fixed broadband, for instance, services trade is positively correlated with both the subscriptions of the broadband, as well as the coverage of the broadband. And in a separate analysis, we also look at the varieties of services counted by the number of services that was available to the country in question. And again, for the fixed broadband, the number of services is positively correlated with the demand of fixed broadband. So that led us to believe that in terms of content and specifically proxied by the number and the amount of services provided, they are positively correlated with the demand and supply of broadband, leading us to believe that it is indeed a demand side factor that could impact connectivity. So with that, here are my concluding remarks. This is still work in progress. We have presented some of the preliminary findings, but we hope that these findings could provide food for thought for further discussion. So we have 4 main findings. First, there's a considerable usage gap for mobile broadband connectivity in Africa, the same for fixed broadband, although we don't have enough data to show it in the graph. The second is that fixed broadband connectivity is more associated with services trade in digitally delivered services, while mobile connectivity is less so. And the third finding is that digital services trade is not sensitive or sometimes even negatively correlated with ICT's regulations in Africa. And the fourth, even though preliminary finding, is that the content and the variety of digital services can drive increased internet use. As next steps, we plan to build our analysis based on a partial equilibrium model and have more different data sources to verify our analysis. But I look forward to further discussion on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation and spot on time as well. So I give the floor to Joel to comment on it, and we look very much forward to your take on also our questions and hypotheses.
Okay, thank you, Hildegun, and thanks a lot, Anakai, for your presentation. First of all, many thanks for inviting me and for also showcasing my research. It's always a pleasure to see that it is read and it is used in new researches. Also, thank you for giving me the opportunity to read and comment your paper, which is really interesting. Really relevant because it addressed, according to me, two important questions that have not yet really addressed in the literature. So the first one is the role of the regulation in the connectivity trade nexus, which is really interesting because generally we looked at the impact of the digital infrastructure, the physical infrastructure on a range of economic outcomes. But actually, this infrastructure will require appropriate regulation to give the expected outcomes. And this is often quite a missing link in this literature. So it is really important to consider this nexus. The second important question is the role also of service exports or service trade in spurring demand for connectivity. This is a really innovation of the paper, and I think that explains why this paper is relevant. And within these two questions, there was this heterogeneous effect of connectivity and regulation in Africa, which is also a very important sub-question. Because Africa received for the last decades broadband infrastructure when submarine cables have been laid in the continent, and also because Africa has a quite different digital development path compared to other developed regions or developing regions. And so this heterogeneous effect actually highlights that in the region, in the continent, there is a kind of dual broadband markets, and this duality in some way streamlines the analysis, and I think that's something could be more central into the paper's development, and I will explain why. And also, I will try to give some perspective in regards to my research on the subject. Why it is a dual market? On the one hand, you have, as it has been said, quite a low fixed broadband adoption in the region. Generally, fixed broadband adoption is concerned a limited number of large and highly productive firms, which are often export-oriented, which have an intense usage of internet. And this digital absorptive capacity makes that increase in bandwidth capacity often leads to a better integration in broadband market for these firms. However, most of the broadband market consists of smaller films, often informal, often less productive, which are not necessarily export-oriented and which have a basic usage of internet and a limited absorptive capacity. So for these kind of productive units, smaller ones, the mobile infrastructure is often the last kilometer infrastructure, while in a more developed markets, the mobile infrastructure will represent more the last centimeter infrastructure. And this is, according to me, very central because in developed markets, the mobile phone will be complementary to the fixed broadband markets. So that's why maybe we see that both fixed broadband subscription and fixed mobile broadband subscription have a positive effect on trade. While in sub-Saharan Africa, often the firms that use internet, broadband internet, do not have an easy access to the fixed broadband infrastructure, and generally they rely on their mobile phone to have access to the market. So this is a critical difference, actually, because when broadband arises, when the broadband capacity increases, these smaller firms are not able to compete with other firms which have a greater digital absorptive capacity. So this is what we have been highlighted in Bruno et al., so in our CEPR working paper. And we show that when there is a submarine cable connecting two countries, and when this one of the two countries is developing smaller countries, we observed an exit of exporters from broadband markets. So maybe this fact could be a reason explaining why digital regulation could have a negative effect on trade in Africa. This is the first reason. The second reason, it has been already invoked, the fact that this regulation may arrive too soon. This is also something that we pointed out in another paper where we show that, especially regarding fixed broadband, when the infrastructure arrives, it has a large fixed cost, and the cost saving will be a critical driver for internet price reduction. And if the regulation introduces competition too soon, the firms will not be able, the telecom operator will not be able to pass on the cost saving to the internet prices. So as it has been said, indeed, the timing of the regulation is critical. But I will go back to the question of regulation to keep on the question of the market duality. So as I said, this segmentation contrasts with other developed markets where mobile broadband access and use is generally complementary to fixed broadband access and use. And generally, the suppliers in this market both use fixed broadband and mobile broadband together to supply the markets. However, in sub-Saharan Africa, we are facing a problem is that there is an important growth in the mobile broadband use, which has as consequence that there is an increased demand for digital products from the market, but the firms may not follow up. So it may also increase sub-Saharan Africa dependence towards foreign markets if the domestic firms are not able to provide their own domestic markets thanks to fixed broadband connections. So this is also an important point. And a last point concerning the duality of the market is the unequal access to energy infrastructure in Africa. So the complementarity of infrastructure is also key, because when you have an access to energy that is lacking, that is unstable, generally will also have an important consequence on fixed broadband take-up. So this was the main point regarding this question about the duality of market. Let me know if I run out of time, because I'm quite, I have a lot of things to say about these fascinating questions. So now about regulation. Also, I really appreciated, as I said, that you looked at the combined effect of the legal infrastructure regulation and the physical infrastructure proxied by fixed broadband access and mobile broadband access. I would suggest that something that could improve the paper is that there are some regulations that are more appropriate for fixed broadband access and other regulations that are more appropriate to mobile broadband access. And this distinction has not been made. And this could probably allows you to have maybe more nuanced results and more precise results regarding the relationship that you try to estimate. And so there are some regulations such as those that will frame market concentration and regulate market entry, which will be particularly effective for fixed broadband market, while other regulations will be more effective at impacting mobile broadband markets, such as interoperability agreement or infrastructure sharing. So this maybe could be taken into consideration in the paper. And also considering the fact that, as it has been said, there may be a timing of regulation that may not coincide with the maturity of the market. There could also be a mismatch between the ambition of the regulation and the capacity of states to implement them. And so this is also a point, since there could be some regulation that are mimicking regulation of Europe, for example, but that may not be adapted to the African context. So maybe this is the point that could be raised either in the discussion, either during the analysis. That I think it's also important to take into consideration. Also consider the fact that internet technologies are network goods, and if you put in place regulation that will promote, for example, competition too soon, all the scale economies and all the network effects that could be related to the fact that there is a limited, at the beginning, limited number of service provider could be undermined. For example, when we look at the development of the mobile money markets in Kenya compared to the mobile money markets in Nigeria, in Kenya, there has been a relatively lax regulation that allow the market to self-organize. So there has been strong scale economies and strong network effects, which encourage the people to adopt the technologies. And when it was appropriated, the central bank and the regulatory authorities started to regulate this market. While in Nigeria, competition regulation entered very soon, and this has undermined the potential network effect of the mobile money technology. So this also could be applied to the fixed broadband market and to the mobile broadband market. So this maybe could be a point that could be discussed. And one last point, general point. I may not have the time to go into the technical comments, so let me know if I exceed my discussion.
So I guess we are a bit,
is related to the estimation of connectivity as a yes. It's
yes,
okay.
Here your main so let's
I'm late.
comment and yeah.
Okay, so maybe I stop right now, or you want me to finish my last point?
Yeah, please finish your last point, but maybe the technical estimation.
Yes, I will send you the reports in any case, so you will have them. So the regarding one critical value added of the paper, I think that could be improved is the relationship between service trade consumption and connectivity. One important thing that has not been done, but which is really interesting, is to discuss more about the mechanism that could tie service trade to demand for connectivity. We need to know how this consumption of digital services pass on the exporting sector. This could be spillover effect, especially workforce movement between firms. So digitally skilled workforce that move through the firms of a given sectors, but that also could be workforce movement between sectors. That could be also mimicking that could be scale economy. So there are potential mechanisms that could explain that. And I think we need to maybe know more about how this happened. So I think that's an important point. Also, one thing that I would have liked is to see whether there are specific service exports that could have important effect on the demand for connectivity. So you looked at ICT services, so that's good, but maybe that you should look further at other services that are critical for the economy, such as transport services or logistics services. Why are they critical? Because the goods trades will be strongly affected by this services development. And so if you have a higher demand for these services, probably this will increase the demand for connectivity because these services are critical for the economy as they impact the whole exporting sector. So this is something that would be really interesting to study. And I think that's okay for now. I'm done. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for very helpful and insightful comments. And I think the issue about mobile versus fixed broadband and the difference between how it's used kind of as complementaries in elsewhere and where people rely more or less singularly on mobile in Africa, and the informality question is really interesting. And I also think this topic of regulation and pro-competitive regulation and how that can actually, in the longer run, stifle competition, that's also super interesting. So thank you so much. And now over to Julia. Looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much, Anakai, for the presentation. That was really very helpful. And I think it sets the background for that discussion. Joël already made some very important points. And I hope that I can add a little bit from a slightly different perspective to that. So first things first, thank you very much for inviting ITU in this discussion and for having me here today. I really believe it's a very, very timely and substantial contribution to a debate that is relevant not only to WTO and ITU and the academic community, but to the global development community and to developing countries in general, with the speed and pace and the scale of transformation that is happening in technology now. We really risk deepening the gaps that exist already in digital. So it is even more important than in previous year to see how we can leverage those gaps. And we can do that by understanding better the interplay between digital development, regulation, policy, trade. And this is precisely what you're doing. And in passing, I also want to just flag that we have done some studies in the past, both on the impact of broadband, both fixed and mobile, on the economy. We have also done regional studies, and I think it's really important that we go into that regional dimension because things look completely different when we scale down to a specific context. And then we have also done work on substantiating the impact of regulation on digitalization and on the development of digital economy. So certainly this is a very original and really important contribution to that same debate. And on a last side note, like Anakai, I need to make a disclaimer that I'm coming here to share my own views. And those are not necessarily the views of ITU as an organization or our member states. Certainly, I'm coming in as an expert, as someone who's doing a lot of work analyzing trends in digital development, but also as a development practitioner and someone who assists developing countries with improving their policy and regulatory frameworks. And also from that perspective, I think your work is actually more than interesting and important in the general sense of the term, but it's actually key to allowing development partners and governments to really fuel that evidence-based decision-making that we've been, as ITU, very strongly advocating in digital transformation. So the paper is very, very rich. So I would certainly not have the time to go through all the things that I would love to have a discussion with all of you. But certainly I would focus on 3 points. And in some aspects of those, we already, one of you already addressed, or the other addressed some of that. But I'm choosing to look at those slightly counterintuitive findings of your paper, because some of them may feel that way. And although they feel that way, I think they are actually perfectly consistent and very coherent with previous bodies of research. And hopefully I can shed some light on that, or at least give you my perspective on why what might sound a little unintuitive is actually a very solid finding, and hopefully also how we can translate that into policy action, because I'm really interested in seeing how those numbers fuel action and some concrete reforms, specifically in Africa. The first point is about that finding about the limited responsiveness of fixed broadband to regulation. It does sound a little counterintuitive, and it may also sound as if regulation doesn't matter. It does, and certainly we have substantial work to support that. I think with the understanding that we have from previous work, it's important to note that the impact of broadband is not linear, whether that's on economic development, whether that's on GDP, or whether that's on trade. And the second point here is that mobile and fixed broadband have a different dynamic, they unfold in terms of their impact in a very different way. And I think Anakai also spoke to that. So mobile broadband generates economic benefits very early. From the very early state of adoption, we start seeing some impact on GDP, and we could also assume that that can also be translated into impact on trade. However, if we continue comparing with global figures, and if we disaggregate countries we're looking at by income groups, we would see that that impact of mobile broadband also reaches a plateau relatively early, because there is only so much you can do with mobile broadband. The case of fixed broadband is the opposite. And the impact of fixed broadband only materializes after a critical mass of not only infrastructure development, but really adoption of the fixed broadband technology happens. And from previous work, we've estimated that that threshold is above 30%. So at about 30%, the impact of fixed broadband starts picking up. And what is interesting is that that impact from there on actually continues quite linearly almost to expand. So beyond those findings, or just if we rephrase that a little, of course, simplifying a little bit, mobile broadband has great impact on developing countries, and fixed broadband has great impact on developed economies and high-income economies. This is why the impact of digitization in, say, OECD countries or high-income countries is greater. And I think that's something that we can also understand in a context of trade. I mean, those with broadband penetration, fixed broadband penetrations in Africa, which are so low, I mean, they're virtually not there. We cannot realistically expect that any impact on anything would happen. And from there, of course, the policy recommendation that you also have in the conclusions of the paper, that we certainly need to redouble effort in building that infrastructure and really making sure that those fixed connections are adopted is a very important one. Now, A second point that I would like to come to is the one that you bring, which is that only countries with regulatory maturity corresponding to what we call the generation 4 of ICT regulation have statistically significant impact of trade and digitally deliverable services. So a significant impact of those. And this is a very important finding. And it really, again, it might sound that earlier levels of adoption of regulation are not so important. So it's certainly not that. From my perspective and from my own experience also on the ground, I take it away that it is hugely important that we use all the tools in the box. Regulators, policymakers, decision makers, all those reforms across the board, stimulating infrastructure development, stimulating services, stimulating the maturity of institutional setups are very important. And unless we achieve a sufficient level of development across the board, again, there is no reasonable expectation. There cannot be reasonable expectation that regulation or that regulatory material would really materialize into a specific impact, whether that's on the economy or that's on trade. And that really speaks to that combined effect of policies. And Joël also spoke to that. I mean, we know that certain reforms, certain policy instruments, they're very important. They're probably more important than some of the others. And it would be interesting also to see how those interact with trade. So is this like one measure or two or three that are more important than all the others? In our case, we've done some work to determine what are the most important factors that impact the development of mobile broadband and fixed broadband, and they're indeed different. I mean, Joël also spoke to that. It's not necessarily the same instruments that we would use for one or for the other. So certainly we need both. Again, I think it's also important to understand the difference, but in order to be able to build sufficient infrastructure and to make a meaningful and universal use of it, I mean, we certainly need all of those. So definitely an important message. We sometimes bundle those reforms under a slightly misleading basic reform label. The basic reforms is like really a lot of things that we need to put in place. Many of them come from the WTO reference paper, and unfortunately in many countries they're still not done. And then of course there are new aspects that also need to be addressed, so certainly we need to address all of them in order to be leveraging the full impact of broadband. And then the third point, last one, promise, Hildegund, is the one on that very interesting question of why sometimes seemingly sound regulatory frameworks do not deliver the impact that we hope that they would deliver on the ground. And there was already in the discussion that suggestion that policy implementation or regulatory enforcement are the main reason why this is not happening. And I believe that that's a major problem in many African countries, not to generalize, not in all, but in many African countries. And of course, policy and regulatory frameworks are only as good as their implementation. And that's certainly an area that needs to be further reinforced. And here we, of course, talk about gaps in regulations, but we also, and very importantly, talk about gaps in capacities, in institutional capacities, in human capacities. And those are very important factors to make that regulation work and to make that regulation deliver. And there was that discussion or that hypothesis that, which is probably more than a hypothesis, that certain regulations have been introduced maybe prematurely in Africa. In my view, that's not that much about the premature introduction of those reforms, but it's more about the different market context and technology development, the moment of technology development that those reforms are introduced, that when developed countries have introduced those reforms, we were purely in the telecom realm, and things were a lot simpler than today. And now we have developing countries grappling with telecom regulation while introducing mechanisms for digital governance and really also trying to regulate digital services. It's a lot more complex than before. So the whole environment is a lot more complex. And again, I don't think that it's that much about the premature reforms. I think those are necessary reforms, and it's actually good if we introduce them early. So the framework is there and we can build around that. But it's more about that the conditions are not the same. There was that suggestion, I think, by Joël, that the pro-competitive a sound pro-competitive environment may also be bad for investment, and that's certainly the case. And we've seen that in many national contexts, not so much in Africa. Africa is not that well known for very competitive markets in the first place. But the competition telecom operators need to deal with now is not that much the competition in their own segment, say mobile or even mobile broadband, but it's really the competition that they face by digital providers, by global digital platforms that didn't exist before. That's really a condition that is relatively recent, and it's something that completely changes the outlook for operators. So certainly this is something to also factor in the analysis. And then there is also one additional aspect there on why sometimes frameworks do not deliver immediately. So we know that also there is a time lag from the adoption of a policy or any regulatory instrument to the moment when it starts delivering certain benefits to markets. We usually count 3 to 5 years. Things are quite slow with policy implementation, even when the capacity is there. So that's also partly something that can explain some of the fact that those regulations are not fully leveraging the benefits of the otherwise good practices that are embedded in them. And I have 2 little recommendations, but I can comment in the end because I think that I spoke for too long, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for very interesting perspectives, and also seen from the ITU's perspective, although you of course represent your own views in this context. And I guess that's the case for Anakai as well. I think one issue that comes up here when we look at regulation and how complex the market has become over the years with the introduction of platforms and the internet and social media and all this playing into the same type of market is something that I think the European Commission and the European regulatory authorities have also struggled with a bit, and that is to define the market for regulation. And I guess that's even harder in an African context. But let me give the floor to Anakai to respond to the comment.
Thank you very much, Joël and Julia, for the very thoughtful comments. I took notes. I think they're very rich, so it would take me some time to digest all of your comments, but just some quick reactions in 3 aspects. The first aspect is about the broad context, and I absolutely agree with you that we want to research this topic precisely because the digital revolution is unfolding rapidly as we speak. If we're talking about artificial intelligence being the next general purpose technology, bringing new boost to the global economy, then the next question is, are we going to address the infrastructure gap so that all the countries can catch up in this technological revolution? So I think the idea of digital connectivity infrastructure and its interactions with services, trade, and regulations comes in this broader context. And the second set of quick reaction is with regard to your comments on the mobile broadband versus fixed broadband. And I absolutely find Joel's comments very fascinating, especially in the sense that mobile, so firms would use mobile broadband when they process certain things in trade activities. Our hypothesis is that they will use it for sort of goods trade. They might use mobile money to pay for goods trade. But when it comes to services trade, particularly services such as telecommunications, insurance, finance, etc., it takes more fixed broadband because you need really that stable, high quality connections in order to deliver these services. And that's where we come from when we try to disentangle fixed broadband and mobile broadband. And I think that also resonates with Julia's comment that your general macro finding that mobile broadband could generate early, fast economic returns, but fixed broadband would sort of bring you to the next mile. So I thought that's quite interesting. And then my third set of quick comment is regarding the discussion on the regulations. And I think it's quite interesting, the example that Joel gave about Africa's mobile money market versus Nigeria's mobile money market. And it seems that pro-competitive regulations and policies needs to come at a time when market players are already present in the market. There is some sort of, the players would have some capacities to provide the services, and then regulations could come in play. But I think at the same time, I think we also take note that first, certain regulations will take years to really take effect. And second, it's sometimes not about regulation itself, the ability to implement these regulations that matter. And I believe the ITU tracker really just tracks the law itself, but doesn't really track the ability to implement these rules. So that might also explain some of the gaps in our empirical analysis. We could indeed, as you suggested, look into some of the sub-indicators in the tracker as well as other indicators of regulations to see what specific types of regulations might have a bigger impact. And in the paper, we have done some regression with like different clusters of ITU's trackers because of the time constraints we didn't present. But I think we can do a lot more analysis to try to pin down what are the factors that might impact their interactions a bit more. So I think with that, thank you so much for your comments. We'll definitely study that in detail, and we'll hope to improve our paper in the next few weeks and a month. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, time flies, so we are already almost at the top of the hour. So let me just wrap up then. And first of all, I think this has been very, very useful and very insightful comments. And one thing I in particular will think and reflect on a lot, and that is this non-linearity in the impact of mobile and fixed broadband. And in that context, it's also this issue, does Africa need to kind of have massive investment in infrastructure from going from this plateau of mobile to kind of taking off in fixed broadband, and what does that mean for the rapid development, say, of artificial intelligence, and how could Africa actually avoid falling further behind and instead leapfrog into the artificial intelligence supported applications in a similar manner as they did for mobile. So, and also the role of regulation and trade policy even in this perspective. So we hope to stay in touch and improve our paper and get the further comments. And just finally, so the April webinar on the African digital transformation, that will be a conversation between Kulofelu Kruger and Nia Mishra, and they will discuss her book. If I remember well, it's the 25th of April. So thanks to the audience, and thanks to the presenters, and have a nice afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.